Mhm. So even though we can explain a lot of the variance in effects to THC dominant cannabis products with the dose of the THC, the sensitivity and the use history of that person with THC, and the set and setting, the contextual factors in which people consume it, there are still a lot of very interesting molecules in these products. Many of them have pharmacological properties that would suggest the possibility that they're contributing to the psychoactive and or medicinal effects. And many people certainly make those claims. There's so many anecdotes out there about this that you can't really ignore them. The idea here is often referred to as the entourage effect. It's the idea that all of or many of the cannabinoids, terpenes, and or other things in the plant interact with each other. Many of them are pharmacologically active at different sites, different receptors, things like this. And it's really the constellation of these things that you consume together with the other factors like dose and context that are going to dictate what the experience is like or what the medical effects might be. Can you summarize what the entourage effect is conceptually in your own words and sort of just start to give us a perspective on how much evidence has existed for this historically before we go into some of your more recent work?
Yeah, so the entourage effect has been around for a long time, and this goes back to research done in the 70s, I think, even and maybe even before late 60s, 70s, definitely by the early 80s, where people would do research studies with a pure THC and then like a cannabis extract or a hashish or something like that, and they would see you know unexpected or uniquely different effects in one study versus another. And there have been some studies that have directly compared these things, but very, very few. Um, and so again, the idea behind the entourage effect and the importance of it to the cannabis industry really emerged in the late 90s and early 2000s when people started talking about making the push for cannabis legalization for medicinal purposes at the state level. There had to be an argument that cannabis as a whole plant entity was uniquely different, was perhaps in some cases better and safer and more applicable for medicinal use or therapeutic benefit compared with just THC, which is FDA approved in the form of dronabinol, right? So there
Mm.
is a pharmaceutical formulation of THC that is approved by the FDA that's legal and can be prescribed. And so there was a big push to really emphasize that,
I see. So
right?
there's not so conceptually there's not just sort of the scientific idea about the interaction of chemicals. There was also a
There's
specific policy motivation for something
very
like
big
this being
policy
true.
motivation. Yeah, very big policy motivation. And again, when you look at the science, there's evidence to support the entourage effect or certain hypotheses there, and there's also evidence to refute it. And as we talked about at the beginning, nuance becomes important, right? So a lot of the interactions and the differences between strains of cannabis or cannabis combinations or whole plant cannabis versus just THC by itself are going to be driven by, um, you know, what relative concentrations are we talking about? What else is in the plant and how it's taken? So one really important a good example of this is CBD, right? And so right now, the common theory is that high CBD strains or high CBD containing plants or cannabis products are safer and less potent than high THC with very little or no CBD products. And a lot of that was driven by flower that came out where CBD was overexpressed, just over the last 10, 15 or so years, right? And while I think the data show that that's the case when it's inhaled, in most cases, not all cases, but where we have to kind of look at the nuance is CBD actually attenuating THC's effects in that situation? Or is, when you overexpress CBD in a plant, are you over or under expressing something else?
Mhm.
The THC concentration in a 1-to-1 flower is much lower. It's usually around 8, 9, 10% of each.
Yeah. So there's like you're basically saying there's a
Potency.
confound. Yeah. If you got higher
Yes.
CBD, you also have lower THC. So is
Also have
CBD?
lower THC,
Yeah.
and you might have higher or lower other things that are very important pharmacologically that we just don't understand yet.
Mm-hmm.
The flip of that is that, well, before I go on the flip, the important thing there too is that there have been a number of studies that have specifically gone after that. Does CBD attenuate the effects of THC? And for every study that says yes, there's a study that says no, and there's probably two that say it doesn't really matter.
Mm-hmm.
So it's in between, right? So it's a very mixed bag. And so why is there a mixed bag? Let's drill down on the research methods. So in many cases, the approach was to pre-dose individuals with oral CBD and then have them inhale THC.
And that's usually with a very high dose of CBD, right?
Different routes of administration here. The timing of the onset of the drugs is going to be different.
Mm-hmm.
And that doesn't fully represent how it's used in the real world, right?
Yep.
So there's methodological differences across these studies that likely explain why some of them say, yes, it attenuates, some say it doesn't. And then you get some that say, not only does it not attenuate THC effects, some say it exacerbates it. And that's where the route of administration comes in. So the flip of this is that when it's inhaled, we see more evidence of entourage type effects where CBD reduces, or you see less strong THC effects. But on the oral dose side, there's more research and a couple of studies from my lab in particular that have come out recently where we say simultaneous oral dosing of a high CBD product, if you match the THC dose, so you get a high THC and a high CBD, THC dose is exactly the same route, same everything. We see an exacerbation of the THC effects. And it's through a metabolic interaction between CBD and THC.
I see. Yeah, that's what I was going to ask you about. So like in principle, in theory, I could explain this, a couple of different ways. One, if you think about concurrent administration through the inhaled route of THC and CBD, and we know pharmacologically, THC is activating CB1 receptors. CBD is not doing that. It's probably actually interfering with the ability of something like THC to activate the CB1 receptor. Now you've got a plausible biological means by which CBD could interfere with THC and potentially mitigate its side effects. On the other hand, I think there's something interesting metabolically going on with respect to how some of these molecules affect liver metabolism. Can you talk about that a little bit?
Yeah, so CBD has been shown to be a pretty potent inhibitor of drug metabolism, specifically the two substrates that are used to metabolize THC. And so in one of our recent studies, again, identical doses of THC given the same ways to the same people in the same study, just on two different occasions. When we had high doses of CBD given with a pretty high dose of THC, 20 milligrams of THC, when we looked at blood levels of THC in these individuals across the course of the study, when the same dose of THC was given with a high dose of CBD, we saw double the THC blood levels and 10 times the 11-hydroxy metabolite THC blood level. So THC is metabolized 2 times. The first time the parent molecule is metabolized to another psychoactive substance, 11-hydroxy THC. And again, so that was increased tenfold at peak levels. And so we're talking about a substantially different drug effect based on just this metabolic interaction.
I see. So the idea there is if you take these things orally, CBD is affecting enzymes in the liver responsible for the metabolism of THC. And so you're actually getting higher blood levels of THC
concentrate. You're reducing your body's ability to eliminate THC. So therefore, your drug effects are stronger and longer lasting than if you take it without CBD. Mm-hmm. Now, again, coming back to one of our other things that we talked about earlier, this interaction is entirely dependent on dose and concentration in your brain and your blood and all of that stuff too, right? And so, we saw this really strong interaction, but this was in a study with pretty high doses of both drugs. And we gave people some other drugs on top of all of that to probe which specific enzymes CBD was interrupting. But we've seen it in other studies as well, as have other scientists. So we know CBD inhibits THC metabolism through oral routes of administration. Now, some colleagues of ours at the University of Washington and Washington State have done kind of preclinical modeling of this interaction, and their science suggests that this is unique to oral dosing and that you wouldn't see the same effects with inhalation. So again, we need to come back. We need more research to find out, okay, across different routes of administration, what's the level of pharmacological interaction and metabolic interaction between these drugs? And at what dose concentration does this happen? And at what ratio of CBD to THC? Does the ratio factor in? Do the total doses factor in? And if so, in what way? And once we do a few more studies like that, I think we can use statistics and modeling to really kind of fill in the blanks on exactly how this is going to happen, to predict the outcome of a particular product being used by a particular individual.
So why exactly would we see such a different effect from oral versus inhaled routes of administration? Is it because when you consume these things orally, they go through the portal vein and a higher proportion is metabolized by the liver before entering systemic circulation?
It has to do with the rate of absorption and the rate of elimination. So when you inhale a drug, your lungs are very efficient drug delivery mechanisms. You basically get almost all of the drug into your blood within minutes. It gets absorbed very, very fast. And so you're getting this peak drug effects right away. Your peak concentrations happen almost immediately, and then your body works very quickly to eliminate. And so that's why with inhalation, the peak drug effects happen really fast, and then you get a pretty linear decline in drug effects, and it lasts, an hour, 2 hours, maybe 3 hours. When you take THC orally, you don't feel anything for usually the first 30, 45 hour, right? And then the peak drug effects are sustained for a longer period of time, and there's a slower elimination. It's because there's a slower absorption of the drug by your gut into your blood. There's metabolism that happens in your gut and as well as after it's absorbed. And so it's a very different level. Your body's continually absorbing the drug in different states of metabolism and breakdown, and for a longer period of time. And so when you have that inhibition happening on something that's happening slower, you can get these bigger, larger differences in terms of impact of liver enzyme functioning.
So, when we start to think about these things in combination, we've already seen from what you've told us, like it gets very complicated very quickly. The dose matters. Probably the relative ratio of compounds matters. The way you consume it matters. There's a whole other class of compounds that we're going to talk a little bit about that we haven't even started to talk about yet, and that's the terpenes. So can you say a little bit more about, what are terpenes and what are some of the more prominent cannabis terpenes? And in the literature historically, do any of them have pharmacological properties that would make us think or hypothesize that they could be contributing to the psychoactivity of cannabis?
Sure. And before I go there, just one more thing to add on that last piece is that the difference in the time course and the rate, the impact on the metabolic stuff. The other factor is that the viscosity of cannabinoids. They're lipophilic, and when you orally ingest it, it sticks to tissue, including your brain. So we find, interestingly enough, when you orally ingest cannabis, even at the peak level, highest drug effect, there are very low concentrations of the drug in your blood. And so it's not really circulating. It's a much slower elimination because of that. So these things get into your brain and just stay there. They camp. And so it's a little bit different there as well.
Yeah, I mean, what? Just one more thing before we move on. That might be worth adding. There is, I very often hear people say things like, "Well, I took 10 milligrams in the form of a cookie, and then I took 10 milligrams in the form of a gummy or a brownie, and it was a very different effect." And presumably, that has to do with the fat composition of the substrate that these fat soluble molecules are in, which would affect the rate of absorption.
Yeah, for certain. And we've seen that, we've heard that now. To add another layer of complexity on top of that, you have the matrix that the drug is in is going to drive how quickly it gets absorbed through the gut, how much is going to get absorbed versus gets metabolized right then and there. What the person ate and how long ago they ate it also impacts it considerably. So if you take a cannabinoid on an empty stomach, you're going to get far less drug. It's the opposite of alcohol and many other medications. You get far less drug absorption than if you take it with a meal, and in particular, a high fat meal. So high fat meals actually protect the drug and get it through your body faster than if you were to take it on an empty stomach or with a low fat meal. And then there's other impacts there too, where there's nanoemulsion technology to try to speed up and protect the drug. So there's a lot of innovation in the cannabis industry right now in this space, again, without much published science. So my colleague, Tori Spindle here at Hopkins, just got a really nice grant from the National Institutes of Health to study this very thing. And so he's going to be doing a research study starting up this summer, where we're going to be giving people, the same high THC distillate extract in a gummy, in a beverage, and in a brownie. And we're going to be able to look at fat content or macronutrient content, as well as the use of nanoemulsion technology versus not. So it'll be a nanoemulsed beverage versus just a straight distillate in a gummy, and the distillate in a high fat brownie formulation. So it'll be fascinating.